So, an introduction to crisis management. Firstly, I'm Stuart Armstrong. For the last 20 years, I've been dealing with crises underwater, but a couple of years ago, I decided that that was a little bit niche, and I would branch out a little and start doing some other things. And I think that gives me a good foundation for the basics of crisis management, and obviously learning, as we all do, as we go along through our business careers. When I'm not doing this, I volunteer with a local Coast Guard rescue team. It's the week of the volunteer, so if you're a volunteer or you have volunteers in your organisation, then well done to all of you. Certainly, in terms of crisis management, tends to certainly exercise the mind in dealing with whatever we get called to through HM Coast Guard. And when I'm not doing that, I try and do some of this, but obviously in our current times, there's not too much of that going on. So let's move on into what is a crisis. There's a definition up there from the ISO. I won't linger in that too long, because obviously a crisis is different things to different organisations. It's natural for us to think of a natural disaster such as an earthquake or a global pandemic, but obviously it could also include things like cyber or indeed some kind of emergency, as indicated in the right-hand picture. But I'm going to look mostly at business crisis management today, and I want to just emphasise the three words that I've underlined in the slide. Things that cause uncertainty, things that disrupt the core activities and processes of the business, or indeed its credibility, and obviously things that require urgent action to resolve. And it's mostly those three things that separate crisis management from emergency response or business continuity, although of course those two other disciplines do overlap. And I think by its very nature, a crisis means that you can't have a defined plan for it. Indeed, one of my colleagues, John, who'll be presenting later in this series of modules, is of the belief that if you've got a plan for it, it isn't a crisis. I think that's an argument I can take to a certain degree, but I think really you're able to plan for things even if you don't know what they are. And so we'll talk through this morning some of the things that we can have prepared in advance so that we can respond to any event that causes uncertainty, disruption, or indeed requires urgent response. So let's start walking through that. So most of what we'll talk about in the meat of this module is in the response phase, but there is of course some activity that can be done beforehand. And it might sound obvious, but the biggest part of crisis management is to try not to have the crisis in the first place. Obviously, you might not be able to stop that event happening, but being prepared is enough to reduce that uncertainty, reduce the disruption, and hopefully reduce the urgency with which you have to act. And some of the activities that you should consider doing in that pre-crisis stage is, of course, preparing your crisis management plan, building and identifying the crisis management team or teams that you're going to use depending on the nature of the crisis, preparing your crisis communications, and our colleague Joanna will talk in some depth about crisis communications in a following module, and obviously horizon scanning in order to work out what's coming your way, what timescale you're talking about, and what impacts it might have upon you. And again, we'll talk about horizon scanning in the future also. So in terms of responding to the crisis, or managing and responding to the crisis, this is what I'll mostly focus on later. And obviously the detail of this will depend on the type of crisis. Now, obviously something like a disciplinary issue, if it's sufficiently large, might well be a crisis, but it's going to need to be handled in a very different way to something like a global pandemic. And again, I'm not going to dwell too long on the communications aspects of the response because Joanna will cover that. But it is really important, as you would expect, to be able to control the narrative from the start. Much easier to do that than have to be on the back foot, playing catch up, and then trying to clarify and adjust any messages that have built up a head of steam as the crisis is developed. And this the response phase is obviously important, where you focus everyone's efforts on what's important. Again, it'll vary depending on the crisis, but normally you would be considering putting people's safety first, much more so or more so than normal. And you might also be making the decisions that determine what you're going to keep doing through the crisis and what parts of your business or organisation you might wish to put on hold or indeed postpone until after the event. And of course, these decisions require constant review. Once your people are safe, your next priority might be something like the environment or indeed looking after your assets. And my colleague Stuart Wallace will talk more in the next session about how we do that leadership decision making, which is so important in that phase. And then post-crisis. Of course, you've survived, that's great, but that doesn't mean that the work's done. It's likely that your plan was found wanting in some areas, and so now is the time to go back and review those areas and find out what could be improved, and also review how the crisis response worked across the whole organisation. Obviously, it might well have gone swimmingly at the senior management level, but that experience might have been very different on the shop floor or in the staff room. And so important to get the feedback from the whole organisation at this phase, feed it back into the review of the plan and work out how you can improve things for the future. And finally, in the post-crisis phase, this is the opportunity to look for opportunities and to minimise future risks. Opportunities, and the COVID scenario that we're all living through at the moment is a perfect example of that. It has driven work from home from across many organisations that may have only had it on the fringes of their consideration at the beginning of this, and there's obviously opportunities there to capitalise on. And similarly, it might identify future risks that you can feed back into your mitigation measures and hopefully prepare for what else is coming down the road afterwards. So the crisis management plan, obviously the name's fairly self-explanatory, but I just want to talk through some of the benefits that come with having a crisis management plan prepared and ready to go before the crisis happens. First and foremost, safety. The more that people know what to do in advance and what their immediate response should be, the safer they're going to be. You're not relying on people trusting their own instincts or making decisions in a pressured environment and potentially making the wrong decisions. So there's definitely a safety aspect to crisis management. Productivity, it will encourage you to focus on what's important and thereby maintain that productivity and indeed recover faster afterwards. Reputation. Your clients and suppliers might insist on you having a crisis management plan that aligns closely with theirs, so that you provide them reassurance that you're prepared for disruption. And similarly, you may wish to demand that of your suppliers and clients. And indeed, you may well be judged in how you responded to a large crisis previously. And finally, peace of mind. Just feeling prepared goes some way to being prepared. And therefore, if you and your team feel prepared, then hopefully you'll be able to respond faster and more effectively and more efficiently should the worst happen. So moving into writing a crisis management plan and what you would wish to consider as you do so. Broken down into 7 steps here, but we'll take each one in turn and have a very quick look at what you might wish to consider as you go through writing your crisis management plan. First of all, you've got to know what you're dealing with, really, and that involves identifying what type of crisis you may be exposed to. So for example, and these are just examples, they will vary across industries and across organisations. some kind of financial crisis, and that might be through a drop in demand for whatever it is you produce or do. Or you might have a loss of value of your assets and therefore can't use them to pay off any future debts. Personnel crisis, and that might be some kind of employee dissatisfaction. It could be something where a member of your staff has been involved in something that they shouldn't have been involved with, and that misconduct, either inside or outside the workplace, might well have an impact on how the organisation is viewed and indeed how the organisation functions if it's a sufficiently key individual. The organisational crisis. So, for example, something that your organisation has done or has resulted in negative impact to your customers. So, for example, something like a product recall where that is difficult to manage and has an impact down your supply chain. There may well be an organisational crisis aspect to that. In a technological crisis, things like when servers go down unexpectedly without sufficient fallback, loss of software or software crashes, or indeed some kind of cyber attack might well lead to that technological crisis. And then natural crises, what you might more obviously expect of a crisis, so hurricanes, floods, that type of activity, and depending on where your company is located or aspects of your company are located, you may wish to prepare in different ways for that. Obvious things like if you have outstations in a hurricane zone, then you probably need some kind of hurricane preparedness plan, and then a crisis management plan sitting above that. So the second stage, this is where we do our analysis. So we look at what we think the crises might be that will affect us, and then we analyze them against some predetermined factors. And again, these are examples. They will be specific to your own organisation. So what will the impact be on sales? For example, unseasonable weather might impact your sales if you're in a clothing business. What about your supply chain? Have you got all your eggs in one basket, either with your upstream supply chain in terms of supplying parts, or indeed your downstream supply chain, in that if your main retailer folds, where do you then go with your sales? Publicity. Obviously, negative publicity is a difficult thing to turn around, and being able to change the narrative in that is important, and that's maybe something you wish to consider, whether or not you have the expertise and ability to do that in-house, or do you need to reach out to get some specialist assistance. And having that in place early is obviously better than having to find it in the middle of a crisis. It will almost certainly impact your expenditure, and therefore that may drive decisions you need to make on what you carry on doing or what you stop doing in order to mitigate any increased expenditure. Similarly, you may need to be able to release funds quickly in order to provide an alternative location or provide additional PPE, for example. How are you going to do that quickly in a crisis scenario where other people may also be affected by the same incident? And also trends. How quickly can you adapt to any changes of trends in a crisis, and in being able to dig into what those trends are, what do they mean, how long term are they, and how you can adapt to them. And then through this analysis process, by understanding which impact will have the biggest effect on you, you can identify the activity and priorities that are most important. And some of those might be short term, focusing on safety, for example, and others might be longer term, focusing on the wider impact to the business and potential recovery. So the third stage is to decide on the type of response you're going to have for each crisis. Now, again, different ways for different crises. Some common methods, though, are the three that I've listed here. So responsive crisis management, where there's a pre-prepared response to a specific crisis, and for example, financial. And that can be adopted at any time. So it's on the shelf, ready to go. Yes, you might need to put the exact details of the scenario into it, but actually most of the actions are there to be taken and stakeholders identified and kept informed, etc., as you go along. Proactive crisis management, again, this is almost where you're anticipating it. Not always easy, but again, if you live in an area that's affected by weather fairly regularly, then you may proactively prepare for that. So for example, if you run a small business that's based in an island, and you know that the ferries to and from that island are often disrupted, well, it might make sense to have some kind of warehousing or stock facility, supply chain facility on the mainland that you can use to tide over the short-term disruption of that weather. And then recovery crisis management. It's probably not efficient to plan for everything, and at some point you're going to have to take on a recovery crisis management approach. So for example, you might have the best pandemic plan going, but then decisions are taken at the governmental level that are out of your hands, and for example, you're directed to close your facilities for a number of weeks or months. Yes, you might have had that in your pandemic plan, but the exact timing of it and how that affects you in this case will probably need some kind of recovery crisis management type activity. So very much trying to catch up in some ways, although you've already got a crisis management plan in place. But remember that your crisis management plan should be at the strategic level. And so, yes, you'll have emergency response plans or business continuity plans, but these are the strategic level things that should flow down into those other plans that you already have in place. So step 4, determining who you're going to need to respond to each type of crisis. Now, I've just mentioned the strategic nature of crisis management. So obviously there's going to be a significant input from the senior leadership team. But I would suggest that you want to keep your crisis management teams as small as possible and only broaden them when there's a requirement to do so. So I'll take, again, the disciplinary example. Maybe it's the senior manager that's been affected by this. You probably only want to consider the senior leadership team, legal, PR, and HR in dealing with that. If it's something like a building issue or loss of an asset, then absolutely you probably need to include the whole organization in order to be able to manage every aspect of that. And I think as the crisis management team, as you develop it, you need to be careful to allow them to be drawn into the technicalities of every response. Remember, you've got experts across the organization that can feed into that team. The crisis management team itself doesn't need to be making the decisions at every level through the organization. Sound leadership, clear communications are going to be their main function, and that will naturally filter down through the organization. And I think just depending on the type of crisis, you'll want to tailor those response teams in order to best facilitate your recovery. And again, that would be considered depending on people's expertise. You may wish to give clear lines of authorization to facilitate decision making through a crisis. And similarly, you may wish to increase reporting requirements and that type of activity in order that the communication comes back up the chain to those that are having to make decisions. And I would just say, be very careful about increasing the workloads on key players through a crisis. Every organization has those people that are key to it and seem to be able to step up to the plate no matter what is put in front of them. But be very careful of overloading those individuals, and therefore where you can share the burden amongst your teams, if at all possible. So step 5, and this is where we're into developing recovery plans for each type of crisis. Now, I would love to be able to go through every type of crisis for every organisation and give you a plan on a plate. We can't do that in a short presentation like this. So I'll just introduce some concepts that you probably want to think about as we do that. So firstly, how long is it likely to take to recover? How long is the disruption likely to last? And that might be a partial aspect, or even indeed a full recovery. What resources are you going to need? Where are you going to get them from if you don't have them in-house? And this is where reaching out to organisations or support functions is worth doing early, so that you understand how they operate, they understand how you operate, and you can lean on them potentially when required. Similarly, who is required? How many people do you need? Is it all hands to the pumps, or are you needing to consider a longer term recovery plan? And how do you go about sustaining or mitigating those high levels of intensity? Similarly, who do you need to engage with across your stakeholder portfolio, both internally and externally to your organisation? So consider stakeholders for each type of crisis you've identified and are attempting to develop response plans for. And as we go through this process, we obviously want to understand what caused the crisis, what indicators flagged early, and what we can use in the future to either avoid the current crisis getting worse, or indeed stop a crisis in the future that you already have gained experience from. And I think that's where it's important to make sure that we're capturing lessons throughout and keeping an accurate record of decisions and how the organisation got to those decisions. So training, probably one of the most important parts of crisis management. The plan only really works if people know what it is, they understand their role and what the intent of the plan's outcomes are. If it's a small or medium-sized organisation, where it might well be that everybody is required to have at least an awareness of the crisis management plan, and those in management or senior leadership positions certainly need to have a deeper understanding in order to be able to respond. And I think in our experience in Inverroy, the most effective way of making sure that people understand the plan and how it affects them is to go through an exercise programme. Start off really simple, tabletop, have those discussions with your teams, work out what's important, what isn't, what will be easy, what will be difficult, and then build on that through question and answer sessions, and then slowly increase the complexity up to maybe a full-on crisis management exercise. Bit of a caution here though, there's a tendency, because people have crisis management attached to their job title, that you end up training just the A-team, and Sod's Law will dictate that most of the A-team are on holiday or at a board meeting or doing something else when the crisis happens, and therefore making sure that deputies are trained is just as important. And of course, it's a natural succession planning function of most organisations. And we've mentioned already the requirement to review plans. That should really be done routinely, probably at least a couple of times a year, because things do change, regulation changes, there will be changes in the organisation, through supply chain or just in terms of people within the organisation. Very important to review crisis management plans following any disruption, because there will almost certainly be lessons learned and identified, and they need to be fed back into the plan so that it works better in the future. Similarly, as your organisation changes, if it's a growing organisation, it naturally becomes more complex, and therefore the crisis management plan needs to adapt accordingly. And similarly, there may well be key players that have changed and wish to input into the crisis management plan and their role in responding to that. And as I mentioned earlier, when you do these reviews of your crisis management plan, I would recommend that you seek feedback across the organisation. And again, that's because just because something appears sensible at the senior level, it might not be practically sensible on the shop floor or further down the supply chain. So do make sure that you engage the whole organisation to review and update plans. So starting to almost come to a close in some ways, looking at the stages of a crisis. So this is where we've done all that hard work, we've got our plans in place, they're sitting on the shelf, ready to go, and people know where they are and they've trained against them. Now, the first thing you'll get are obviously some warnings, and hopefully your plan, as you developed it, will have identified some triggers. So a change in the environment that you're operating in. And it's worth at this point, if there is a significant trigger or something in the wind that you are concerned about, getting a crisis management meeting early and thinking about or talking through that situation with the crisis management team. Now, of course, you don't have to respond to everything, but actually getting that conversation started early, getting people's the hair in the back of people's necks just slightly more alert is worth doing, rather than having to play catch up if you thought nothing was going to come of it. Then the next stage would be to go into a situation assessment. So this is where you would measure up the scenario that you are now facing against that for which you planned. Do they match? Are there significant differences? Do we need to do a quick, rapid replan of the crisis management plan? And I think there's a natural tendency at this stage to kind of think that things won't be as bad as they could be, but I would just caution that there's taking action early probably isn't a bad thing, and don't just try and hope for the best at this point. And again, at this point, the crisis management team should be meeting, discussing any likely impacts and deciding on the type of response that you're going to take, and whether that's kind of proactive or maybe a bit of a response type activity. So then into response, this is where you are, the plans are very much open. You've communicated across the organisation that you are taking crisis management activity. You will probably be communicating out to your stakeholders at this point, and this is really a very communication heavy area. So do take time to consider the messaging and make sure that everybody is pulling in the same direction. The management stage, I can't be too prescriptive here, again, because everything is very dependent on the situation and the organisation it affects. But do try through the management stage to be logical and methodical and keep those communications going. So do try and get into what is in the military we call a battle rhythm. So maybe that's a daily staff update, or every couple of days. Maybe it's weekly updates to your stakeholders, or whichever time frame you're looking at, just to drive that logical and methodical approach through the crisis. Similarly, through this management phase, really keep an eye on your people. And again, I emphasize those key players that you always seem to be able to rely upon, but suddenly this is the straw that breaks their back, and you do need to look carefully at those individuals. Into resolution, so we're past the peak and beginning to return to some kind of normality. There's a natural sense of relief here, but don't forget the importance of capturing those lessons and trying to improve things for the future. Probably not the time to be starting to make changes at this point, but as we go into the recovery and the review phase of updating plans and identifying those opportunities for change, then that's certainly where we would look to be at the final stage. And then my last real area that I'm going to cover this morning before we go into some questions is organisation. Now, I've emphasised earlier how it's very much a strategic function, and so obviously the senior leadership team have an important role to play, both in driving the culture of crisis management and supporting it across the organisation. It's very likely, of course, that the crisis management plans will be drafted by others, but it really needs the senior leadership to understand them and endorse them so that they don't start pulling in a different direction once the crisis starts. So you can imagine maybe a very heavy focus on the financial aspects at the senior level, but actually they need to be responding in line with the plans, which of course were built and put together in a non-crisis environment when people had level heads and cool thoughts, and so therefore trust your plan, stick to it, and allow the effort you've put into that to drive the communication through the whole organisation, and that saves any confusion that might come about in the pressure of the crisis. I mentioned how you may wish to adapt crisis management teams depending on what the scenario is, but also you may wish to adapt them depending on how your organisation is configured. You might have a very natural tiered system of something like gold, silver and bronze, which falls naturally into your management structures. You might be more regionally organised, or indeed it might well be organised by a specific business area. And again, that is very much organisation dependent. But just talking regionally, things like natural disasters, that drives a sort of regional response potentially, because you probably don't have much call for earthquake crisis teams in Leicester, but you probably do in Los Angeles, for example. And finally, I've listed it as functions, but we often see crisis management roles as being tacked on to somebody's job description. They probably don't come up too much in appraisals and almost certainly won't be remunerated specifically. And therefore, there's a natural tendency for people not to prioritise it. And you don't want to find that's the case when it's too late. So do try and include crisis management function into job descriptions, include it in appraisals, include it in your performance reviews and the like. And at least that way it keeps the culture through the organisation of crisis management, and from that then creates this natural tendency to train teams and include deputies in that type of activity. And so just to sort of summarise then, obviously preparing your business to respond to uncertain or disruptive events urgently, planning for that is unlikely to be time wasted. Obviously crises take many shapes and forms and they will probably occur at the worst time, but being ready to be able to make the difference, being ready to respond may well be the difference between being able to survive and coming out stronger, or indeed actually failing. And of course it will improve your business's reputation amongst customers, suppliers, and indeed its employees. And I think probably the coronavirus situation proves that unlikely things do happen, and when they do happen, they affect everybody to a greater or lesser degree. And so maybe this is the time that you want to consider rewriting your crisis management plan so that you can be ready for whatever comes next. And obviously if you need any help with that, then Inverroy can do so. And our contact details are on the screen if you wish to reach out to us. And I think that is the end of my scripted stage. And Matthew, if we've got any questions, I'll happily take them.
Okay, Stuart, thank you very much for your thoughts there. And it just strikes me, just while people, if you've got a question, by all means type it into the box. I have one already from Paolo that I'll come to in a second. But under the quick summary, if you can see it coming and you can identify a plan for it, hallelujah, that's great. Your risk registers and so on. But it's the defined by scale, complexity, and uncertainty that we're dealing with here. And whatever you can do to create that plan, to create that foundational, that framework, is going to be better than not having it. And exactly as Stuart said at the start there, the best crisis is the one that we can avoid by the horizon scanning, that identify and analyze to get yourself in a position that you are ready for it. And And if we think about COVID, yes, some of us may have seen it coming a week or two in advance, others a month or two, but equally, no one saw the scale and the complexity of and the duration that that's been, and therefore, a classic crisis scenario. Albeit that we knew that pandemic was on the risk register and was an event. I don't think many pandemic plans spoke about borders being closed and the like. Stuart mentioned the idea of the leadership team and selecting your team and training them. I think it was Mike Tyson that said, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. And all too often, the senior leadership team talk about, oh, I'm good at this because I'm the senior leadership team. They're not always the right people to lead the crisis because they are not necessarily used to making decisions without all the information in front of them. And that's something that Stu will have a talk about in the next presentation. And finally, this idea of training and how does that work? All too often, we deal with the risks that are on our risk register. So we have an exercise or training about a fire. Okay, that's great. It's very difficult to persuade people to train something that is so low probability but high impact, if you like. If it's low probability, oh, well, we've got something else that we can use instead for that scenario, which means you never really test the crisis of blue sky thinking of how do you resolve it. And therefore, you never really identify the weakness in your team on that leadership side, because it's something they're sort of familiar with to start with. And I use the analogy sometimes that if you can think the scenario, then it can happen. And the idea of Stuart's Royal Navy, vessels crashing into islands, well, it happens. I think the story of two people having a fight on the bridge and crashed an oil tanker, I think it was Mauritius a few years ago. If I'd have written that in a scenario, people would have laughed at me, and yet it happens. And therefore, thinking it through, if you can think it, then it can happen. Anyway, I'm conscious of the time. So Paolo's question was all about the most dangerous time in a crisis, in Paolo's words, were when we're in safe but not normal, and we're not back to business as normal. So perhaps in where we are now with in the UK with COVID, is it important to have a plan to take you from the response phase to the new business as normal, in order to avoid those further exacerbation of the crisis through unintended consequences, and perhaps in a systems type approach, if you rush something too quickly, you miss out a step, which leads you back to the start, and you're back in crisis mode again. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, firstly, hi Paolo. Paolo and I worked together a very long time ago, so good to see you on here. I think you're absolutely right. And crisis management by its nature, I think, has to be constantly reviewed as you go through it, because it's not like an emergency response plan where you can, tick off a series of lists or follow a flow chart and you're at step 10. It's very much this uncertain world, and therefore you've constantly got to be going through a cycle in order to review where you are at within that crisis. So yes, you might have made everybody safe by moving them to a different place. Let's say it's some kind of threat to life type scenario. As you step back from that and then move in towards recovery, of course, well, you can't just move everybody back onto the site or onto the platform. You've got to make sure that that platform is safe for them to do so. How do you do that? Maybe put in some small, highly trained teams to do, check the integrity of things, and then bring back teams slowly. And the COVID response is exactly that at the moment. We're trying to work out how we can get people back into workspaces safely. And again, maybe that's something in most people's pandemic plan that you wouldn't have, because you might expect them to work from home for a while, get better, and then come back to work normally. Whereas actually this scenario shows that we do need to take baby steps and do things carefully. So yeah, absolutely. Constantly do that review cycle, make it part of your battle rhythm, so that you're going back and looking at things that you might think you've already finished, but you actually just need to consider them again as you move forward.
Okay, Stuart, thanks for that. And your answer there reminded me that it's just what they do in the oil and gas, the energy industry, and therefore presumably with most major engineering products, you do not just turn on high pressure systems and hope that it's going to be okay. Mayor Giuliani's quote about hope is not a strategy. You test it one step at a time and carefully ramp it up so that you're ready. And eventually we get back to the new business as usual state with the new conditions. So thanks for that. Absolutely spot on. For the people on our call, thank you very much. I haven't seen any other questions, and I'm conscious that the time now is exactly 10:44. So if we can take a 5-minute leg stretch, and Stu will start with the second module at 10:50 UK time, talking about crisis leadership and decision making. But Stuart, thank you very much for your presentation, the first of our 6 modules, and we'll rejoin in 5 minutes time, 10:50. Thank you, everybody.